The council chamber stretched beyond sight, a cathedral of alien architecture where 1,000 species had gathered to decide the fate of a world they barely understood. Earth. That pale blue dot on the edge of the Orion Spur, home to beings who called themselves human. The vote had been unanimous, or nearly so. 743 species in favor of annexation and forced labor conscription. 256 abstentions, mostly from civilizations too distant to care. One vote against, from a minor trade federation that would be overruled and forgotten by morning. The humans would be informed of their new status within the galactic community: property, resources, a workforce to be distributed among the member species according to economic contribution and political standing. The Qurati High Chancellor had raised 3 of his 7 arms in the gesture of absolute authority, his translator converting his chittering speech into 1,000 languages simultaneously. Humanity, he declared, had been evaluated by every metric the galaxy deemed relevant. Their technology was primitive, barely capable of reaching their own moon with consistency. Their military consisted of chemical propellants and crude atomic weapons, laughable compared to the singularity cannons and quantum disruptors possessed by even second-tier civilizations. Their political structures were fractured, divided into nearly 200 separate governmental entities that could barely cooperate on matters of planetary survival, let alone present a unified front to the cosmos. Most damning of all, they possessed nothing the galaxy needed. No rare minerals that couldn't be found elsewhere. No unique biological compounds. No strategic position that mattered in the grand schema of hyperspace lanes and wormhole networks. They were, in the calculation of every species present, utterly without value except as labor. The decision had been efficient, logical, and according to every simulation run by the galaxy's most advanced computational matrices, completely without risk. But that was before anyone truly understood what it meant to back a human into a corner. That was before they learned the difference between having nothing to lose and having everything to fight for. That was before they discovered that weakness, when weaponized by desperation and ingenuity, could become a strength that shattered every assumption the galaxy had made about the natural order of things. The message was delivered to Earth's governments through a simple gravitational pulse, the kind used for basic interstellar communication. It informed them they had 1 local year to prepare for integration into the galactic workforce. Resistance would be met with pacification. Cooperation would be rewarded with the preservation of cultural artifacts and limited autonomy in designated reservation zones. The tone was neither cruel nor kind, simply administrative. This was business. This was how the galaxy had always functioned. The strong did not devour the weak outright anymore. That had been the way of things before the council established order. Now, the strong simply put the weak to work. It was considered enlightened. It was considered merciful. Humanity, most species agreed, should be grateful they were being given the opportunity to contribute to galactic civilization rather than being left to their inevitable self-destruction. The projections showed Earth consuming itself within 3 centuries anyway, torn apart by resource depletion, environmental collapse, and the same tribal conflicts that had marked their entire evolutionary history. The galaxy was offering them purpose. The galaxy was offering them survival. The galaxy was offering them a future, even if that future meant their children would be born into servitude on 1,000 different worlds, never to see the sun that had warmed their ancestors. What the galaxy failed to understand was that humanity had already survived 1,000 extinctions. They had crawled from the mud with nothing but determination. They had conquered their world not through strength, but through stubbornness. And when told their future had been decided, they did something the galaxy had not anticipated. They smiled. They prepared. And they began to build weapons from the one thing they possessed in abundance that no other species truly. The first ships arrived at Earth exactly 1 standard year after the declaration, as promised. 3 harvest cruisers, each the size of a small continent, accompanied by 24 escort frigates. The fleet carried processing centers, neural compliance implants, and transportation pods designed to ferry millions of humans to their assigned work locations across 70 different systems. The Qurati had purchased the largest allocation, nearly 40% of Earth's population. They needed workers for their atmospheric processing plants on sulfur worlds where automated systems degraded too quickly. The Kthrani Confederacy had bought 22%, requiring bodies for their deep mining operations in high-gravity environments. The rest would be distributed among smaller purchasers, each species having submitted bids based on their specific labor requirements. It was all very organized. The fleet commander, a veteran of 24 integration operations, expected the usual response. Some defiance from the military forces, quickly suppressed. Some theatrics from the political leaders, making speeches for historical record before accepting the inevitable. Perhaps a few scattered resistance cells that would take years to fully pacify but would pose no real threat. What he did not expect was silence. The Harvest fleet entered Earth's orbital space and encountered no resistance because there was nothing to resist. The planet appeared completely abandoned. Cities stood empty. Military installations were dark. Communication networks had gone silent. Every satellite in orbit had been deliberately deorbited, creating a shell of debris that made close approach hazardous but not impossible. The fleet commander ordered scans. Deep penetration sensors that could detect heat signatures through miles of rock and metal. The results made no sense. There were humans present, billions of them, but not where they should be. They weren't in the cities or the towns. They weren't gathered in the obvious refuges. Instead, they were scattered across the planet in a pattern that appeared almost random until the tactical AI analyzed it and realized with something approaching digital horror that it wasn't random at all. It was strategic. The humans had abandoned everything that made civilization convenient and retreated into the places where their technology mattered least and their intimate knowledge of their own world mattered most. Mountains. Jungles. Arctic wastes. Underground complexes that hadn't existed in the previous surveys. They had taken with them only what they could carry, but what they carried had been chosen with frightening precision. Not the trappings of their culture or the luxuries of their society, but weapons. Supplies. And something the sensors couldn't quantify but the commander's instincts recognized immediately: intent. This wasn't hiding. This wasn't surrender delayed. This was preparation. The commander made his first mistake then. He assumed that preparation without superior technology was meaningless. He ordered the Harvest teams to deploy. 10,000 soldiers descended to Earth's surface in armored dropships, equipped with stunners, neural disruptors, and containment fields. They were professionals who had pacified 100 worlds. They had fought species with exoskeletons that could shrug off plasma fire. They had subdued hive minds that coordinated attacks with perfect precision. They had broken civilizations that had fought wars for thousands of years. They gave humanity 3 days. The first team to go silent was collecting subjects from what had once been called the Rocky Mountains. 17 soldiers in full combat armor, supported by autonomous drones and protected by personal shields that could deflect everything from kinetic rounds to directed energy weapons. They found humans, exactly where the sensors said they would be. A small group, maybe 40 individuals, apparently unarmed. The team moved in with practiced efficiency. Containment field established. Neural disruptors primed. Protocol demanded they attempt communication first, offering the subjects the opportunity to comply voluntarily. The team leader activated his translator and began the standard integration speech. He got 4 words in before the mountain itself seemed to come alive. The humans hadn't been unarmed. They had been patient. The soldiers' shields stopped the first volley of gunfire, primitive chemical weapons that shouldn't have posed any threat. But the humans weren't aiming at the soldiers. They were aiming at the ground beneath them. At the carefully placed explosive charges that had been waiting for weeks. At the structural weaknesses in the rock face that human geologists had spent generations understanding. The mountainside collapsed. 14 soldiers died instantly, crushed by thousands of tons of stone. 2 more were killed in the chaos that followed as humans emerged from positions that sensors had somehow missed, using weapons that were laughably primitive but applied with surgical precision to the weak points in armor that no species had bothered to reinforce because no one fought this way anymore. 1 soldier escaped. He made it back to his ship and delivered his report with what his species considered fear, though the translation was imperfect. The humans, he said, fought like the planet itself was on their side. What he didn't understand was that it was. 3 days became 3 weeks. 3 weeks became 3 months. The Harvest Fleet, designed to process millions of compliant subjects, found itself engaged in a grinding war of attrition against an enemy that refused every convention of civilized warfare. The humans didn't mass their forces for grand battles. They didn't defend strategic positions. They didn't even seem to have a command structure the fleet's intelligence could target. Instead, they simply made every meter of their world cost blood. A patrol would enter a forest and disappear, found days later with their equipment stripped and their bodies marked with a simple message translated through their own communicators: "Go home." A processing center would be established in what seemed like a secure location, only to have its water supply poisoned with compounds so crude they wouldn't have been considered weapons by any civilized species, yet so effective that the facility had to be abandoned within hours. Dropships would land and find the ground beneath them had been undermined, collapsing into tunnel networks that seemed to spread like roots beneath the entire continent. The fleet's casualties mounted slowly but inexorably. Not the catastrophic losses of a pitched battle, but the steady degradation that came from fighting an enemy that treated their own lives as ammunition and spent them with terrifying calculation. For every human killed, they extracted a cost. Sometimes it was equipment. Sometimes it was time. Sometimes it was just the psychological weight of knowing that nowhere on this planet was safe, that every shadow might hide someone willing to trade their life for yours, and that the humans seemed to possess an inexhaustible supply of individuals willing to make that trade. The council chamber, light years away, received reports with growing confusion. The operation should have been complete. The humans should have been processed, transported, and distributed to their new assignments. Instead, the fleet commander was requesting reinforcements. Not a small deployment to mop up resistance, but a full battle fleet. He was requesting authorization to use weapons that were forbidden under the integration protocols. He was requesting, in barely coded language, permission to simply exterminate the population and classify the operation as a failure. The request was denied. Earth had been purchased. Contracts had been signed. Economic projections had been made. Politically, admitting that humanity had successfully resisted integration was impossible. It would raise questions about other species. It would inspire resistance in populations that had been compliant for centuries. The Council's authority rested on the assumption of inevitability, the certainty that resistance was futile. If humanity proved otherwise, the entire structure of galactic civilization might falter. So instead, they sent the reinforcements. A battle fleet designed for actual warfare, not population management. 50 capital ships. 200 support vessels. 250,000 soldiers. Enough force to conquer an advanced civilization, being deployed against a species that barely understood fusion power. It should have been overwhelming. It should have ended within weeks. 6 months later, the battle fleet was gone. Not destroyed in some climactic engagement, but bled away piece by piece in a conflict that had no front lines and no end. The humans had learned to hack the alien targeting systems, feeding them false data. They had learned to build improvised weapons from captured technology, turning the galaxy's own sophistication against itself. Most importantly, they had learned that the species trying to enslave them had never fought a war where victory was measured not in territory gained but in the will to continue. The galaxy's forces could have won, eventually, if they had been willing to pay the price. If they had been prepared to lose millions of soldiers to claim billions of slaves. If their populations back home had been willing to accept the casualties, the cost, the years of grinding conflict required to break a species that had already decided death was preferable to chains. But they weren't. The Qurati pulled out first, declaring the investment non-viable. The Kthrani followed within weeks, their mining operations falling behind schedule and their shareholders demanding explanations. One by one, the species that had voted so confidently for Earth's enslavement withdrew their forces and wrote off their losses. In the council chamber, the matter was quietly removed from official records. Earth was redesignated as a quarantine zone, too costly to integrate and too dangerous to destroy. A perimeter was established. Ships were warned away. The humans, it was decided, could have their little world. They were welcome to it. But that should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. 20 years passed. Earth remained isolated, humanity licking its wounds and rebuilding from a war that had cost them nearly 1 billion lives. The galaxy moved on, as it always did, finding new resources to exploit and new populations to integrate. The matter of Earth became a cautionary tale, shared in military academies as an example of poor planning and in economic forums as a lesson about accurately assessing risk. But it was not forgotten, not entirely, because the galaxy had learned something troubling from its failure. Humanity hadn't just survived. They had evolved. During those years of isolation, something remarkable happened. The species that had been dismissed as technologically primitive began to advance at a rate that shouldn't have been possible. The conventional understanding was that civilizations developed technology in a steady, predictable curve. You mastered fire, then metallurgy, then chemistry, then physics, each step building on the last over thousands of years. Humanity had followed that path until the galaxy came calling. Then they had compressed centuries of development into decades. The ships that began appearing at the edge of Earth's system were crude by galactic standards, but they existed. Fusion drives that barely achieved 0.01 light speed, weapons that were simply scaled-up versions of the chemical and atomic devices they had used in the war. But they were there, and they were improving with frightening speed. The humans had learned something during their fight for survival. They had learned that technology wasn't magic, it was just science applied with sufficient determination. They had captured enough alien equipment to reverse engineer the principles, even if they couldn't yet match the execution. More importantly, they had learned that the galaxy was not unified in its strength. The species that had come to enslave them had been powerful, yes, but they had also been comfortable. They had fought wars according to rules and conventions developed over millennia of civilization. They had possessed overwhelming advantages in technology but had never developed the desperate creativity that came from fighting for survival. Humanity had both now. They had the foundation of galactic knowledge, stolen and salvaged and brutally reverse-engineered. And they had the memory of every slight, every insult, every casual dismissal of their worth. They had the rage of a species that had been sentenced to slavery for the crime of being weak. The first human ship to leave their solar system was more of a statement than a strategic asset. It was slow, vulnerable, and carried only a token crew. But it reached the nearest inhabited system and delivered a message that was broadcast on every frequency the galaxy used for communication. Humanity had not forgotten. Humanity had not forgiven. And humanity was coming. The message was dismissed as bravado by most species. The Kthrani, in particular, found it amusing. They dispatched a single frigate to Earth's system to remind the humans of their place. The frigate never returned. Neither did the battle cruiser sent to investigate. Or the task force deployed after that. Each time, the debris told a story the galaxy didn't want to hear. The humans were winning not through superior technology but through superior tactics. They fought like they had during the integration attempt, using their own weaknesses as weapons. Their ships were slower, so they fought from ambush positions in asteroid fields and planetary rings where speed didn't matter. Their weapons were weaker, so they targeted life support and propulsion systems instead of shields and armor. They couldn't match the galaxy's ships one-on-one, so they didn't try. They built 10 ships for every one the enemy fielded and accepted casualty rates that would have ended any civilized war but only seemed to make humanity more determined. And slowly, inevitably, the mathematics that had once seemed to favor the galaxy shifted. The Cthrani were the first to realize the danger. Their merchants reported human ships appearing in trade lanes, not attacking but watching, learning, mapping the arteries of galactic commerce. Their colonies on the frontier began reporting strange signals, evidence of human survey teams cataloging resources and defensive capabilities. Their military analysts ran the projections and saw something that terrified them. At current rates of advancement, humanity would achieve technological parity with galactic civilization within a century. That alone would have been manageable. But the projections also showed something else. Humanity was breeding. Not at replacement rates like most civilized species, carefully managing their population to match resources. Humanity was expanding as if growth itself was a weapon, as if sheer numbers could compensate for any deficiency in individual capability. And they were right. The delegation arrived at Earth's orbit with all the ceremony that desperation could muster. 30 species, including the Qurati and the Cthrani, represented by their highest officials. They came unarmed, their ships broadcasting peace on every frequency. They came bearing gifts, technology, and resources and formal apologies. They came with treaties prepared by the galaxy's finest legal minds, offering humanity everything from full council membership to exclusive trade agreements. They came because the alternative was war. Real war, not the integration operation that had failed so catastrophically. War with a species that had proven they would rather die than submit. War with a civilization that was advancing fast enough to be a peer competitor within generations. War that would cost millions of lives on both sides and destabilize the entire galactic order. The human who met them was unremarkable by their standards. No elaborate cybernetic enhancements. No signs of genetic optimization. Just a woman in a simple uniform, representing a species that 50 years ago had been deemed worthy of nothing but chains. She listened to their speeches with patience. She reviewed their offers with what might have been amusement. And then she spoke, her words translated into 1,000 languages but requiring no interpretation for those who truly listened. Humanity, she said, remembered the vote. Every species present, every civilization that had casually decided Earth's fate over whatever passed for drinks and dinner in their cultures. Humanity remembered being evaluated and found wanting, measured against standards they had never agreed to and dismissed as property. The delegates began their apologies then, carefully prepared statements acknowledging errors in judgment and offering reparations. The woman let them finish. Then she explained what humanity wanted. Not reparations. Not apologies. Not even justice, because no amount of punishment could undo what had been done. What humanity wanted was very simple. They wanted the galaxy to remember what happened when you backed them into a corner. They wanted every species, every civilization, every corner of known space to understand that humanity had been weak once and had survived anyway. That they had been dismissed as primitive and had adapted. That they had been sentenced to slavery and had chosen extinction instead, then had the audacity to avoid both. The treaties were signed eventually, but not on the terms the delegation had offered. Humanity joined the galactic community, but as equals who had earned their place through blood. They received no special considerations and asked for none. They simply wanted to be left alone to grow, to expand, to become whatever they chose to become. And in the council chamber, when the vote was recorded, there was a new understanding. Humanity had proven something the galaxy had forgotten over millennia of comfortable civilization. That weakness was not permanent. That today's victims could become tomorrow's nightmares if you gave them sufficient motivation. That there were fates worse than death, and slavery was one of them, and that some species would choose annihilation over submission every single time. The galaxy learned its lesson. Earth was no longer quarantined. Human ships moved freely through trade lanes. Human colonies sprouted on unclaimed worlds. Human engineers and scientists contributed to galactic knowledge. Human soldiers, to the surprise of no one who had fought them, were recruited by species who had once tried to enslave them, because desperation had forged them into something formidable. But in every interaction, in every negotiation, in every moment when power dynamics shifted and the strong considered what they might take from the weak, there was a memory. Of the vote. Of the harvest fleet that never completed its mission. Of the battle fleet that disappeared trying to subjugate a species that shouldn't have been a threat. Of the moment the galaxy realized that humanity's greatest weapon was never going to be their technology or their strength, but their absolute refusal to accept that their fate was anyone's decision but their own. The delegation departed Earth's orbit with their treaties and their relief and their carefully maintained dignity. Behind them, humanity continued doing what they had always done. They built. They grew. They prepared. Not for conquest, they had no interest in becoming what they hated. But for the certainty that no one would ever again mistake their love of peace for weakness. No one would ever again confuse their preference for diplomacy with inability to fight. And no one would ever make the mistake of assuming that humanity would submit simply because submission seemed logical to species who had never had to choose between freedom and death. The council chamber was quiet these days when discussions of integration arose. When species were evaluated for forced labor conscription. When the strong considered what they might take from the weak. In that silence was the memory of a vote that had been unanimous. And the knowledge that humanity, that impossible, stubborn, beautiful, terrifying species, would spend the rest of their existence ensuring that no other civilization would ever face the choice they had faced. The galaxy had come to enslave Earth. Earth had reminded the galaxy what it meant to be free. And in doing so, they had changed everything.